What is up, my dudes, and welcome to the first episode of The News. It's The News, a show by Tacticon Armament. At the beginning of the year, me and Nolan went down to the border and we did a little bit of investigative journalism, which was kind of outside of both of our wheelhouses, but I think it really woke something up in both of us, definitely for me. I realized that the reality of truth is often much more gritty and uncomfortable than we like it. And that's why there's PR spins and there's always a narrative being pushed to you by both sides of the political aisle and by the media apparatus as a whole. And you have big-name figures like Mark Zuckerberg and even Elon Musk coming out and releasing the Twitter files. Both of these individuals saying that their platforms were pressured by the FBI to censor Americans' free voice. But the question that we're going to answer today is that true? And to answer that question, we have to go back in time. Back in time to June 17th, 1972. Now, on June 17th, 5 men were arrested inside the Watergate Hotel, breaking in to the DNC Democratic National Headquarters. One of those men, James McCord, would identify himself in court the following day as a White House consultant who had recently retired from a government agency. When the judge asked him what government agency, he whispered quietly, the CIA. Now, these men were not arrested with crowbars and sledgehammers. They were arrested with sophisticated burglary tools, sophisticated listening and communication devices. They had keys to a specific room, room 214, and they also had $2,300 in quote-unquote crisp $100 bills. The American public were immediately interested in who these men were and why they had broke into the DNC. And more than that, they were interested as to why so many of the men seemingly had government contacts. They wouldn't have to wait long, because on June 19th, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward would publish the first of many articles exposing the Nixon administration and how they had broken into the DNC headquarters. Now, Bob Woodward would get all of his information that Carl and him would need to write these articles from a very secretive source known widely as Deep Throat. We wouldn't know until 2005 who Deep Throat was, so for the sake of keeping this story interesting for you, you're not going to find out who he is until later also. Now, on August 8th, 1974, Nixon resigned from office after being found guilty of obstruction of justice. And this is where our story starts to get interesting, because we have to understand why Nixon was found guilty of obstruction of justice. And that takes us back in time again to June 23rd, 1972. Now, on June 23rd, 1972, Nixon was recorded in the Oval Office by his own taping system, which is kind of an odd thing that he would tape all of his conversations and be as dirty as he was, but he did, so more power to Nixon. On June 23rd, 1972, President Nixon would tell his then Chief of Staff, H.R. Haldeman, and his Chief Domestic Advisor, John D. Ehrlichman, I don't know, don't quote me on his name, Ehrlichman. He would threaten them both to threaten the then CIA director to put pressure on the FBI to stop investigating the Watergate break-in. And the question leads, why would the CIA listen to what Nixon wants? What could Nixon possibly have to force the director of the CIA's hand? This is why this audio recording is so important, because for years later, the American public wouldn't really be able to connect the dots of what he was threatening, because like any good corrupt government official, he didn't say outright what he wanted to do. He just made references to things. And those references would specifically be to bring up the, quote, whole bay of pigs thing, as well as a lot of hanky-panky that CIA Director Richard Helms was involved in at the time. He wanted the then director of the FBI, Louis Patrick Gray III, to stall or kill the investigation into the break-in, and he hoped that his leverage onto the CIA would make that happen. Nixon had overplayed his hand and just went to war with the intelligence agencies. Now, this is where Deep Throat becomes very important again. Now, Deep Throat, we would find out in 2005, was a man named Mark Feltz. Mark Feltz was pressured by his daughter on his deathbed to come clean and admit that he had been Deep Throat during these investigations. And Mark Feltz is a very interesting character because he was the deputy director of the FBI at the time. He was the number 2 in charge at the FBI while the Nixon administration was attempting to blackmail the director of the FBI. And it makes a lot of sense when you know that little fact that the director of the FBI would ask his number 2, the deputy director, to leak a bunch of pertinent information to the press. And the only question that's really left is, how would he and Bob Woodward have known each other? And that's a very easy answer also. See, Bob Woodward, months prior to being an investigative journalist, was a naval officer working at the Pentagon. Mark Feltz was also a naval officer before working for the FBI. There's a good chance that they knew each other from their time at the Pentagon or their time in the Navy, but they for sure knew that the other one could keep a secret. Now, with all of this breaking out into the public eye and the general American public finding out just how corrupt the Nixon administration had been, well, ignoring the fact that the corrupt CIA and the corrupt FBI had leaked the information to blackball the corrupt president. Moving on. The American public had a newfound interest in government corruption, and that interest would be picked up and filled by an investigative journalist for the New York Times named Seymour Hersh. Seymour Hersh is an extremely influential reporter in this whole story. Seymour Hersh had been an anti-war activist and reporter for the New York Times, and he had covered such things as the My Lai massacre, where 504 Vietnamese civilians were gunned down by American troops in Vietnam. He had an incentive to expose the government for the things that they were doing. And in 1973, the director of the CIA at the time, after taking control after the Watergate scandal and finding out that there were CIA members directly involved in the scandal, ordered all of his heads of departments to create a report internally about what they had been up to essentially since the end of World War II. This report would come to be known within the CIA as the Family Jewels, a 693-page classified document outlining everything that the CIA had done on and off the books. Seymour Hersh was able to get some of this information and publishes an article in December of 1974 outlining some of the things that the CIA had been up to, including their connections to Watergate, but more importantly, their connections when it came to media and information censorship and some of their work controlling the media. This leads to an even more increased public interest in the CIA's domestic operations within the United States, something the CIA is not legally allowed to be doing. This open American pressure would start what we know now as the Church Committee hearings. An Idaho senator named Frank Church would hold a Senate Select Committee hearing and summon the then CIA director, William Colby, to testify and explain the 693-page document known only as the Family Jewels. These hearings would expose the quote-unquote hanky-panky that Nixon had attempted to blackmail the CIA director with during his presidency. Now, what the American public would find out during these church hearing committees is infamous, and most of the things we've heard about. Things like MKUltra and mind control experiments done by the CIA on unwitting American citizens, as well as unwitting American service members. We knew from these hearings that the CIA was up to no good. We knew from these hearings that the CIA had carried out different projects and different assassination projects and coups and overthrown power all around the world. But the things that have become memory hold and buried in our mind are three very important programs. The first of these very important programs was codenamed Shamrock. Shamrock was a project that started in 1945 under the name of Minaret. This project was a warrantless collection of American data. It was surveillance on the American public, specifically through Western Union, but any kind of intelligence that they could gather on the American public, they did. And this went hand in hand with McCarthyism and the Red Scare during the 1950s. The CIA and the FBI believed that gathering all of the communications that went in and out of the country was the best way to find Russian spies and Russian assets, or just communist card-carrying members. From the surface, that doesn't seem totally insane, especially considering at the time they were really just intercepting telegrams and not necessarily all of your phone calls or your emails or your internet search activity. But it was the beginning of what the CIA and the FBI and the NSA now use as data collection practices on the American public now. This kind of project would really see it strengthening post 9/11 under the Bush administration with the act called the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act gave the NSA essentially unfettered access to all of your personal information. Cell phones, emails, anything that you do, talk, see, anywhere, all of it. The CIA, the NSA, the FBI, every single department within the federal government has access to your information warrantlessly. Now, the NSA and the CIA came under a lot of fire because of this specific project, and they closed down Shamrock in 1975. But in 1978, the NSA was back and swinging. The NSA would then establish the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or as we know it today, FISA. FISA allowed the federal government to have secret courts that issued secret warrants to do secret surveillance of American citizens and our foreign enemies. These FISA warrants have been used against sitting and running presidents. They've been used against American citizens. They've been used against allies. The FISA courts are a direct violation of your Bill of Rights and the Constitution as it was written by our forefathers. Now, there were two more very important projects that were exposed during these church committee hearings, one of those being Project Mockingbird. Now, Operation Mockingbird has gained some level of notoriety amongst conspiracy theorists and alt-right conservative news anchors like Tucker Carlson because he is exposing the government's influence on the media and social media companies. Project Mockingbird, however, dismantled during the church committee hearings at the time involved more than 400 media personnel as well as 25 different media agencies. Project Mockingbird's main goal was just to control the media's information flow to the American public and control the narrative being spun out to the American public. This is where Carl Bernstein is very interesting because he would write an article for the Rolling Stones in 1977 heavily exposing the CIA and the NSA's involvement in the media, which is an interesting side note to me because he would expose the Nixon campaign along with Bob Woodward, who is widely considered to be a part of Operation Mockingbird, understanding his previous government employment and how he was used to fight back against Nixon's blackmail against the FBI and the CIA. Now, another interesting program to be exposed during the church committee hearings was COINTELPRO, which was an FBI program that ran from 1956 until 1971. This FBI program targeted American political organizations in an attempt to subvert, surveil, and disrupt. The FBI would specifically target anti-war movements, Black Panthers, and other civil rights movements, and has been widely considered to be responsible for the assassination of such political movement leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. The reason that Project Mockingbird and Project COINTELPRO are so interesting is because those two efforts were to subvert the media and to subvert any alternative point of view or anyone else speaking out against what the media had to say. They wanted to disrupt, and they wanted to make it seem like anyone who wasn't carrying the official narrative was an insane person. Now, if you think that this sounds strangely familiar, you're right. These efforts clearly carry on today. When Julian Assange, who was a journalist and a hacker, began working for WikiLeaks and was assisted by Chelsea Manning, we'll ignore the name change, to document potential war crimes as well as just truthful reporting on the failures within the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars, he was turned into a national criminal. Julian Assange had to run abroad and is still currently wanted by the United States government for his acts of espionage. It's truly a dark time when exposing the government's failures can make you an international criminal labeled for espionage. But the government wouldn't stop with Julian Assange, and neither would the truth seekers. Edward Snowden, who was an NSA intelligence contractor, would also expose a global surveillance program. Julian Assange exposed the fact that operations like COINTELPRO and Mockingbird were very much still going on, and Edward Snowden exposed the fact that Shamrock-like operations were also very much still going on. These two men provided irrefutable truth to the world that the United States government was attempting to subvert truth and pressure good American citizens into censoring their own speech. We can see the use of the media apparatus to censor and control free American speech in such a poignant example like Elon Musk having bought Twitter. Immediately after buying Twitter, Elon Musk releases a treasure trove of internal documents to several investigative reporters, the biggest name of them being Matt Taibbi. Matt Taibbi and Elon Musk worked together for more than a year to expose what is now known as the Twitter files, which was once again irrefutable truth that the intelligence agencies, namely the FBI, was putting an intense amount of pressure on social media companies to control what information was allowed onto their platforms. Elon Musk was then immediately treated by the media apparatus. The mainstream established media began treating Elon Musk, someone who donated to Bernie Sanders' campaign, an outright proclaimed socialist, as being an alt-right racist extremist, a man who grew up in Africa. Clearly, the deep state had an incentive in making Elon Musk and the Twitter files seem like conspiracy theories, alt-right extremism, anything that they could do to discredit, dismantle, and remove their talking points from the general public conversation. Mark Zuckerberg wrote a very short but very poignant letter outlining the fact that the FBI had put pretty intense pressure on Facebook to censor what the American public could or could not know about the effectiveness of vaccines or the dangers of COVID or many other different topics that are just uncomfortable for the federal government to address right now. Topics like the economy, the war in Israel, the war in Ukraine, or ever-increasing tensions with Russia and China. Now, all of this begs the question, just how far are these intelligence agencies willing to go in order to hide information and hide their corruption? A lot of people point to the JFK assassination as the CIA having done it because of the fight between the executive office and the intelligence agencies. A widely known fact is that the JFK wanted to get us out of the war in Vietnam. He did not want to be involved in overthrowing Fidel Castro in Cuba and kind of single-handedly created the failure that was the Bay of Pigs. If you don't know about the Bay of Pigs, it's worth looking up. The CIA had attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro with trained Cuban nationals, and they were going to back them up as soon as they got onto the beachhead with American forces and CIA assets. JFK stepped in and said, absolutely not. So the Bay of Pigs essentially massacre was all of the Cuban-trained foreign nationals attacking Cuba and no Americans coming to help. Almost immediately following the Bay of Pigs, JFK was assassinated, leading many conspiracy theorists to believe that JFK had been killed by the CIA and the intelligence agencies as a whole because of his internal war with them. And all of this leads us up to the shots taken at former President Donald Trump, a man who has made himself an outspoken fighter for the people and an enemy of the state. And when you look into the details of just what the shooter was allowed to get away with that day, from flying a drone over the crowd to riding a bicycle with a rifle in his hand nearly a mile from where he parked his car to climb a roof 100 yards from where the president was speaking. We also know that the Secret Service did not deconflict communications with local law enforcement and created seemingly the perfect environment for a shooter to slip through. With the FBI showing up within days of the shooting, not to conduct an investigation, but to clean the crime scene, we're left with one uncomfortable question. Are all of the intelligence agencies once again working against the American people and attempting to silence the voice of the American people's warrior? Frederick Douglass, a freed slave, once said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." So let us endeavor to struggle together so that we can see clearly the attempt by the deep state to control public information and the narrative that has persisted despite the champions of freedom. We must support those who seek truth, we must oppose censorship, and we must pursue righteous struggles. It's your responsibility to seek truth and to struggle in order to build a brighter future. Remember, it's okay to be dangerous. And I'll see you soon. Make sure that you guys go to TacticonArmament.com to support this YouTube channel here and the free flow of American information and support an American patriot near you. There's always awesome sales going on. Right now, it's 50% off for Labor Day. And if you want to support me personally, make sure that you go to MadMinuteTacticians.com. Check out the Tactician. It is my rifle custom built for you by Wolfpack Armory out of West Virginia. It has a chrome-lined carbon fiber barrel, CMC, single-stage 3.5-pound trigger, spring coast springs, a B5 buffer system, and my pretty mustache face on the side of the gun, which makes me think maybe I need to grow a mustache again. Comment down below what you guys would like to see in the next episodes, topics that you would like to see us go over, truths that you would like to see us bring to light. Yeah, and that's it. Thanks for being here.